Hello and welcome to the Future of the US-Afghanistan Strategy. My name is Yalda Hakim. I'm an anchor and foreign correspondent for the BBC, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. This week marks a year since a historic peace deal was signed between the United States and the Taliban. It was meant to create a framework for getting America out and Afghanistan at peace. Yet, according to the United Nations, violence is now up. The Taliban continue to be in league with al-Qaeda, and the Biden administration faces a crucial dilemma. The deal commits the US to withdraw completely from Afghanistan by May the 1st. By all accounts, intensive debate is now taking place inside about whether to leave according to plan, and if not, what to do next. In DC, this is a question of policy. But for Afghans, this past year has not brought peace. It has brought not only more violence, but a new and even more horrific kind of violence, the targeted killing of civilians. This week alone, 3 female journalists were killed. Morsal, 18 years old, and Sadia, 20. Shanaz was also 20. They were walking home from work when they were attacked. So lots of important questions to discuss. And with that, let's go straight to our panelists. They need no introduction, but nonetheless, I shall introduce them. General Joseph Dunford, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Commandant of the Marine Corps, and Commander of Coalition Forces in Afghanistan, and most recently co-chair of the Afghanistan Study Group, whose report was released a few weeks ago. Ambassador James Cunningham, former US Ambassador to Afghanistan, also former Ambassador to Israel, and former Ambassador to the UN. Lisa Curtis, who served as the NSC Senior Director for South and Central Asia and Deputy Assistant to the President, over 20 years of service at the CIA and State Department and Congress, and now Director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at CNAS. And of course, Richard Fontaine, President and CEO of CNAS. Thank you all for joining us. I'd like to ask our panelists to begin with some opening remarks, and I'd like to ask the audience to please start sending your questions through, because once they're done, I'd love to put some of those questions to the panelists. So with that, can I please ask General Dunford to begin?
Hey, Yalda, thanks so much. It's good to be here with you and the other panelists for what you have described as correctly as a timely discussion. Lisa asked me to begin with a brief overview of the Afghan Study Group. And as you mentioned, I was the co-chair of that group, along with Senator Ayotte, formerly Senator of New Hampshire, as well as Nancy Lindbergh, the former president of the U.S. Institute of Peace. The group convened back in the spring with congressional funding and direction. And we had 15 members of the group, as well as more than 20 members that were senior advisors. And all of these individuals would be familiar to the audience. I think vast experience, both in the government and with regard to Afghanistan and South Asia. And then in addition to leveraging the expertise of the members of the group and the advisors, we conducted over 60 consultations with members of the Afghan government, Afghan civil society, regional actors, NATO allies and partners, as well as those back here in the United States, stakeholders, both in and out of government. And what I thought I would do before outlining the recommendations that we made is to talk about the key judgments that we made in our report in 4 major areas: the security environment, the stability of the Afghan state, the region, and the current peace negotiations. Because these key judgments, and I certainly won't go through all of them, but the key judgments that I'll highlight really do provide the context for our recommendations, and probably more importantly today, a good basis for the discussion that we'll have. With regard to security, we judge that the threat to the United States from terrorist groups in Afghanistan is diminished, but because of the efforts of the U.S. trained and supported Afghan forces, as well as the continued U.S. military presence in Afghanistan. We did make an assessment that U.S. withdrawal would provide an opportunity for these terrorist groups to reconstitute, and we judged that reconstitution, rebuilding, if you will, would take place over the course of some 18 to 36 months. Not a surprise, we judged that the Afghan forces, Afghan National Defense Security Forces, are highly dependent on U.S. funding and continued operational support, and they will remain so for some time. And then we judged that the probability of a civil war is high in the wake of a precipitous U.S. withdrawal. With regard to stability of the state, our analysis and our recommendations were very much informed by the fragility study group conducted by the Carnegie Endowment, CNAS, our host today, as well as the U.S. Institute of Peace. And that resulted in the Fragile State Act, which many of you might be familiar with. By definition, we judge that Afghanistan is a fragile state, given the state of its institutions, as well as disputed political legitimacy in Afghanistan. But at the end of the day, despite being highly dependent, we judge that the Afghan governing institutions can, with continued support, deliver minimally effective governance. Perhaps the most important judgments in our report concern what we see as the opportunity to enhance regional and broader international diplomacy. And while we did not go back to critique any efforts that were done in the previous administration, in fact, we wrote our report to build on the progress that had been made in initiating the Afghan peace negotiations. One of the issues that was highlighted in a number of our engagements was the opportunity to improve both regional and broader international diplomacy. And we did find that there was a foundation for that regional diplomacy in a number of elements. And I just briefly share a few of those elements. One, stakeholders to include Pakistan, China, Russia, India, all agreed that an Afghanistan that is at peace with its neighbors was desired, one that doesn't allow its territory to be used for attacks on other countries, one that's not a venue for proxy warfare, one that is not a source of mass migration or illicit narcotics, and one that's interconnected with the region. And so while we're not naive with the challenges associated with building a regional framework for diplomacy, we did find at least that there were some foundational elements that can be used to build on that. With regard to the Afghan peace negotiation, this is something that's certainly been covered widely. Our conclusions in this area, our engagements highlighted that we believe the Taliban were not meeting the conditionality of the February 2020 agreement. And of course, this was in the three main areas that have been discussed widely now: progress towards peace in the form of a peace agreement, a genuine and a broad reduction in violence, and the demonstrated will and capacity to prevent Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and other groups from using Afghanistan as a platform for terrorism. And with regard specifically to the relationship with Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, we were informed by, and our findings are very much consistent with the report that was delivered by the United Nations in the fall and the report that was written by the United States Treasury here in January. And while we do speak quite a bit about the Taliban not meeting conditionality, we also highlight the importance of the Afghan government participating in the process in good faith. And so just looking at our approach and the recommendations, it's important to say today that we didn't just make a recommendation. We tried to look at all of the available pathways that were available to the current administration, and each of those pathways are highlighted in the report, along with the risks associated with each one of those pathways, as well as the probability of successfully achieving an end state over the course of 5 years if one of those pathways was pursued. And while it was difficult after 20 years, we made an effort to give this challenge a fresh look. And we do believe that the way we've integrated security, diplomatic, and assistance recommendations provides new opportunities, even as we build upon the Afghan peace negotiation. And without understating the challenges, I think one thing I'd want to emphasize is the group was compelled by the argument that we should seek to take advantage of the opening that currently exists, but to do so in a way that serves U.S. national interests and preserves the gains of the Afghan people that have been made over the past 2 decades. And in the interest of time, I won't go through in detail each of the recommendations, but I'll close by briefly summarizing the 5. One was to provide clarity in the end state. All parties need to be clear as to what the United States sees as an acceptable outcome. We did offer an end state in our report that's consistent with our national interests, but the emphasis really is on a post-peace Afghanistan that can either control its own borders to prevent it from harboring terrorists or accept international assistance to do so. I mentioned already reinforcing conditionality, the final troop withdrawal in those 3 areas I mentioned. Third, we believe it's critical to clarify U.S. commitment to Afghanistan. I think all of us know the unhelpful hedging behavior that has frequently occurred in the region, and we think strong clarity of commitment and specificity of commitment in all areas, both with regard to the government as well as security and development assistance, would be important. Fourth, and this is something I touched on earlier, we address the importance of a concerted diplomatic approach, regional diplomatic approach to the Afghan peace negotiation. We offer some specific considerations that include a third-party mediator, perhaps the United Nations, the continued need for a full-time U.S. negotiator, and support for the five-nation facilitation group, which consists of Germany, Indonesia, Norway, Qatar, and Uzbekistan. And then, of course, we emphasize the importance of close consultation with NATO and partners. And finally, we address the need for an overarching diplomatic approach, both regionally and internationally, not only in support of the Afghan peace negotiation in near term, but long term to facilitate the integration of Afghanistan into the region. So with that just brief overview, Yalda, I'll turn it back to you and look forward to questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, General, for that overview. Can I now go to Ambassador Cunningham to give us his opening statements?
Thank you, Yalda. So I thought we might take a look at where we are right now in light of the Doha Agreement and the discussions that are going on. For many of us, this is deja vu all over again. We have an American president faced with an arbitrary deadline for full withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan. Our allies, our partners want us to stay. The proposed withdrawal is not based on conditions on the ground. There isn't any serious political or diplomatic strategy to prepare the ground for if there were a withdrawal of troops. And it won't come as a surprise to any of you that I believe that the troops should not be withdrawn. The Taliban have not complied with Jihadist, which was unrealistic in the first place. But the challenge now is whether there's to form a diplomatic strategy that will create a foundation for success, and that will be extremely difficult to do. If you go back a year ago, when the agreement was being finalized and then signed, at the time were very clear by Secretary Pompeo, for instance, who said the agreement signed for both a conditions-based and phased and for the commencement of negotiations.
I think.
And he said our withdrawal sets a high bar for the things briefings. Public was not obligated to withdraw in the absence of fulfilling those conditions on what was, all of us realized, a highly unrealistic timeline. So none of those conditions have been created. The Taliban haven't met their commitments, and they haven't paid any price for not doing so. For them, from the outset, according to their own public statements, as well as things that they've been telling to Afghans and others, in their view, this process that's now underway is a withdrawal process, and it's basically how can the Afghan government surrender. And another complication that should have been addressed in the negotiations is that the Taliban are continuing to hold inhumanely and without reason an American contractor as a hostage named Mark Frericks, and he should be released as a priority. The basic question about Doha has always been whether it's about withdrawal or about peace on terms, getting to a peace on terms that Afghans and others in the international community can agree and accept. I, like many others, was skeptical about the agreement, but agreed that it was useful to give it a chance to see if one could test the proposition that the Taliban were actually interested in negotiating. I think so far the answer is no. That doesn't mean that we ought to give up. But if the agreement is about getting to a peace agreement, it needs to be recalibrated to restore the conditionality that was supposed to exist at the outset. And a peace agreement between Afghans, among Afghans, needs to be a fundamental condition for eventual withdrawal of foreign forces. So there's now a extremely challenging, even historically challenging task for the United States and the international community to get the Taliban to understand that the restoration of the Islamic Emirate is not in the cards, but that peace is our priority and that it's possible. The international community needs to make clear to the Taliban that it won't accept the return of Taliban rule by force and terror, that such a regime would be internationally isolated. That eventuality would almost certainly cause a return of civil war to Afghanistan, and it would open up the space again for terrorism. And as General Dunford just outlined, the Afghan Study Group report makes clear the unacceptable risks of withdrawal. At this stage, the choice for President Biden may not be pleasant, but it's clear. Will the United States stand with the with its Afghan and international partners in pursuit of peace and in recognition of the need to preserve the gains that have been made and recognize the sacrifices that have been made? The cost of doing so, I believe, is acceptable. The cost of not doing so will be severe. Over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And can I go to Lisa now?
Thank you, Yalda. Yeah, the point I want to make is that it's possible and necessary for the Biden administration to leave troops in Afghanistan beyond the May deadline and continue with the Afghan peace process. Let me first explain why it's necessary. A full international troop drawdown under the current conditions would put the Afghan state at severe risk. It risks a civil war breaking out, and it would enable the reemergence of an international terrorist safe haven. Despite having signed a peace agreement with the U.S., the Taliban have shown very little signs that they are actually interested in a peace process. As you mentioned, they have killed human rights workers, democracy activists, journalists in the last few months. They've attacked military checkpoints and bases around the provincial capitals in what looks like preparations for trying to take over those capitals when they judge the time is right. And the most blatant violation of the U.S. Taliban agreement is the continued relationship that Taliban has with al-Qaeda and the fact that they allow al-Qaeda training in Taliban-held areas. So there's no indication that the Taliban feels real pressure to break with al-Qaeda. They may understand the need to keep al-Qaeda under wraps until international troops depart, but then what? Who is going to protect global counterterrorism interests in Afghanistan? I would argue that it is the Afghan National Security Forces, who we've been partnering with successfully over the last 20 years. No one should think that the Taliban will be our counterterrorism partner. For continued success against terrorists in Afghanistan, like the Afghan raid that killed senior al-Qaeda leader Abu al-Masri last October, we do need to continue to work with the Afghan security forces. And for there to be an Afghan security force, there must be an Afghan state, which brings me to my next point, which is that excluding the Afghan government from the Doha Agreement was a mistake. This helped the Taliban achieve its goal of claiming the government as illegitimate. And by the same token, it's not advisable to rush toward an interim government before the Taliban have reduced violence and demonstrated a genuine willingness to find a peaceful solution. Trying to set up an interim government by May would tip the balance in the Taliban's favor and only help them come back to power. Now, I'll be clear, the Taliban will be reluctant to renegotiate the current agreement. They are too strongly advantaged by it, and they have witnessed the United States make concessions, like forcing the Afghan government to release 5,000 Taliban prisoners without having to reciprocate in any meaningful way. But as flawed as it is in the U.S. interest to salvage the current U.S. Taliban agreement. And one way to move forward is to bring greater attention and urgency to the part of the agreement that requires a comprehensive ceasefire and political roadmap. I think it's reasonable for the international community to insist on greater progress in the intra-Afghan negotiations before fully departing. The agreement acknowledges that the withdrawal, intra-Afghan dialogue, and a comprehensive ceasefire are all interlinked. And focusing U.S. leverage on gaining this ceasefire and political roadmap would demonstrate that the U.S. seeks a genuine peace process that reduces violence rather than an exit from the war cloaked in the facade of a peace deal. The United States will get backing for steering this new course from its European and NATO allies, who are also concerned about a destabilized region, empowered terrorist groups, and a potential refugee crisis. So keeping U.S. troops in Afghanistan while preserving the Doha Agreement will certainly be challenging. Fully withdrawing troops by May 1st would be disastrous. Thank you.
Lisa, thank you. And can I go to Richard now?
Thank you, Yalda. I'm trying to make 2 points. The first is the way we think about Afghanistan, both as a policy matter and as a political matter in Washington. We have treated the war in Afghanistan the way we have treated many tough foreign policy and national security issues, which is a problem to be solved. And we've tried to solve it. So, of course, the United States tried to bring the war to an end through defeating the Taliban outright on the battlefield. Taliban remains strong as ever. Trump administration pursued the negotiated solution, one that ideally would have Taliban forswear al-Qaeda, embrace the Constitution, share power peacefully with the existing government, uphold the rights of women and girls. That appears no likelier than defeating the Taliban on the battlefield, whether or not we have a new negotiation. I think there's a lesson in some of this, which is that the war in Afghanistan is not a solvable problem in the way that we would like to have finality to this. And by treating it as such, then we risk making things worse by forcing finality into a situation that won't allow it. And we've seen this movie before in Iraq, when in 2011, we decided we were done with the war in Iraq and withdrew all American troops rather than leaving a residual presence there. And of course, we know the story there, and we're back in Iraq, at least arguably in numbers greater than we would have been had we left a residual presence that kept ISIS at bay. So the key here is to manage the situation in Afghanistan, not to try to solve it outright through a final negotiation that will give us either everything we want or a deadline for withdrawal of American troops. And then we will just sort of roll the dice and see what happens after we leave. But rather to retain a residual troop presence in the country indefinitely, with or without an agreement with the Taliban, that would allow for continued counterterrorism operations, assistance to the government, deter the Taliban from doing what they clearly want to do, which is get their people out of prison, send them back to the battlefield, get the Americans out so they don't no longer backstop the Afghan government, move into the cities, topple the government, and take power again. And to watch that and have to deal with it from a far weaker position after an American withdrawal seems to be a risk now we're taking if the costs associated with staying are acceptable. And Ambassador Cunningham touched on this. I'll just touch on the politics of this a little bit, because one often reads and hears that this is a forever war, and Americans are very tired of the war in Afghanistan, quite understandably, and they just simply won't tolerate an indefinite American presence in Afghanistan. That seems really wrong to me. The notion of ending the forever wars resonates. When you ask someone, are you in favor of forever wars? You're in favor of continuing to stay in Afghanistan forever? Of course, you're going to get the answer is no, but the intensity of that feeling is low. I mean, last time I checked, there's not a lot of protests on the streets demanding the withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria or anywhere else. Pew put out a poll this week that asked Americans what they would give as top priority for the United States as a long-range foreign policy goal. Taking measures to protect the United States from terrorism was in second place, right behind protecting American jobs. 71% said that should be a long-range foreign policy goal. Reducing U.S. military commitments overseas was 17th on the list. 29% said that should be a top policy goal. So it's not clear to me at all that the president is under any real political compulsion to withdraw American troops from Afghanistan and try to wrap things up there. Now, there may be, as we could discuss, I think that the policy merits of doing so are also not very good. But I think the president actually has much more leeway in terms of the domestic politics on this, and sometimes attributed to it. And then the final thing I'll just say on the politics is it's often offered as a sort of fallback position. Well, we'll withdraw the American troops. We won't be militarily engaged in Afghanistan, but we'll continue to write big checks to the Afghan government and the security forces. And if you look at the history of military interventions in over the past 50 or 60 years, there's a pattern, which is after U.S. military disengagement, the willingness of the U.S. Congress to write gigantic checks to keep security force going in another country starts to diminish pretty quickly. You've seen this in Vietnam. We saw this to some degree and indirectly in Afghanistan itself after the Mujahideen support and ended in the Soviet withdrawal. So I think the politics is such that the president has much more leeway than some might suspect when it comes to making decisions about American military presence there. And there's a very close link between that presence and the willingness of the Congress to support our friends in Afghanistan. So let me leave it at that and turn it back to you, Yalda.
Richard, thank you so much. Can I go to General Dunford first? I just wanted to ask if the study group had recommended asking the Taliban for a 6-month extension.
Yalda, we did not. We didn't recommend putting another time-based condition in there, and we went back to the conditions outlined in the report. And furthermore, we thought that the best way to approach this wasn't necessarily just bilaterally between the United States and the Taliban, but that if the Taliban were hearing a similar message from all of the stakeholders that a precipitous withdrawal in May was not to anybody's advantage, get back to the conditionality of the February 2020 agreement, that was the best approach. We felt like, and some people have put out the 6 months. We felt like we might be in the very same place we are now 6 months from now if we take a time-based as opposed to a conditions-based approach. So the short answer is no, we didn't.
And for all those people who are putting out that 6-month extension out there, I mean, frankly, what if the Taliban say no?
Look, first of all, if we leave in accordance with the February 2020 agreement, we judge that there's a high probability of civil war, and that's been discussed by a couple of spokesmen. So that's the outcome that we know will be in place if we leave. We believe that the Taliban seek many things. 1, relief of sanctions. 2, international legitimacy. And 3, even if they return to power in some form, they recognize that continued international assistance is necessary. So they may say no, but they have every reason to continue to support the peace process if our judgment of the leverage that we have and perhaps haven't necessarily exploited yet exists.
Okay, Lisa, I'll just come to you. I mean, you were at the NSC. Just help us understand how President Trump thought about Afghanistan and the differences between the approach, between his approach and other parts of the administration. And did that detract from policy?
Well, clearly, President Trump felt like he had made a campaign promise to end the war in Afghanistan, bring U.S. troops home. So that really did drive his fundamental beliefs about what he wanted to see happen in Afghanistan. But I think, as time went on, he recognized that the cost of withdrawing too quickly could be pretty high, in that a terror safe haven could reconstitute, another attack could happen on the U.S., and he would be holding the bag. So I think that every president who has come in, has not wanted to keep U.S. troops there indefinitely. However, they also realize there's a cost to withdrawing fully, and I think President Trump recognized that as well. As we've talked about, there was a peace process that was started. And I would say that these peace talks have made more progress than any peace effort in the last 20 years. And that's why I argued in my remarks that we should try to salvage it. We should try to continue it. But we do need to recalibrate the terms because, as I mentioned, the Taliban has received all the concessions thus far. And that's not the point of a peace process. The peace process is for both sides to compromise and to come to a peaceful solution.
If we are in a position where the Taliban don't want to recalibrate, because as you say, they have come out on top with this peace deal, where are we left then?
Well, if we're left with the Taliban being able to, take over large parts of the country or come back, I think we're back to square one. We're going to see Al-Qaeda rebuild itself because we have not seen a separation between Taliban and Al-Qaeda. We continue to see training of Al-Qaeda in Taliban-held areas. So we essentially would have accomplished nothing if we allowed that reemergence of the terrorist safe haven. I think a fundamental requirement of any peace agreement is that the Taliban break ties to Al-Qaeda and are clear that they're not going to allow Al-Qaeda on Afghan territory. They're not going to allow international terrorists to come into Afghanistan, because the fear is that if the U.S. were to depart, the jihadist forces, not only Al-Qaeda, but other jihadist forces, would feel they had had a victory, not only over the U.S., but 40 NATO nations, and you would start to see foreign terrorist fighters converge back in Afghanistan.
Okay, I'll just go to Ambassador Cunningham. I mean, what does a realistic deal with the Taliban actually look like? Is power sharing truly something that's realistic? I think Ambassador Cunningham. Oh, can you hear me?
Well,
we seem to have.
I think one administration's approach to negotiations.
Sorry, go ahead.
Are you having a problem?
Yes, I think
me?
Your connection is a little bit poor.
All right, it looks like it's strong. Can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay. So one of the things that the Trump approach to the negotiations got right was the negotiations need to produce an Afghan solution, not a solution conceived of or imposed from the outside, which raises questions about the discussions that are going on right now. But in any event, the Afghans need to find their way forward on this. In terms of what happens if the United States does not withdraw, its foreign forces don't withdraw in May, the Taliban will react badly. That's to be expected. They may walk away from the negotiations. They've already threatened a return to levels of violence that no one has seen yet, I think was one of the phrases that they used. One has to expect that. But what's needed in response is a coordinated, cohesive, united American, international, Afghan response to that, to go back and recreate conditions that were supposed to have existed in the original agreement that would pair withdrawal of forces, to the achievement of peace, and to a ceasefire. Those are the pieces that need to be reestablished and resynchronized with each other, so that you have a multilateral, multifaceted strategy for pursuing peace on the basis of a security platform that a relatively small number of American and international forces will be required to help the Afghan security forces provide. Without that security platform, there isn't any realistic prospect for negotiations. And without this coordinated diplomatic strategy and program to help shape the ground for the negotiations, there won't be much chance of success either. But that's what we have to try to do, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, Richard, if we just talk about peace deals historically, I mean, history would suggest that when you have a peace deal, then you need peacekeepers to really police it, to enforce it. So let's just take Bosnia, for example, and there were peacekeepers that were needed after the Dayton Accords to keep the peace. Yet the sort of debate in DC, the way it's framed in terms of a peace deal, it's always about allowing foreigners to leave Afghanistan. Do you think that we're missing something here?
Well, there's a couple things that are missing. If you look at Dayton or some of these other things, you had either you either have a stalemate among the warring parties, such as that both of them conclude that peace is better than indefinitely continuing the fight, or you have such firm external pressure on the parties around the table and believe that there's going to be an alternative future. And the latter was sort of one of the kind of models for Dayton, which is why it happened in Dayton rather than in the Balkans. Here, the idea of deploying, a nationwide peacekeeping force to enforce a peace between the Taliban and the government seems remote. But the prior problem is that the Taliban is convinced that they have won, and now it's just a matter of time before they reap the benefits of that victory. That they don't accept the legitimacy of the existing government. They think they're puppets of the infidels and the occupying force. They evince no real desire to compromise with the government, and the pressure that remains on them to change that position would be diminished if there was a withdrawal of foreign forces, not increased. And so what that leaves you with, I believe, is the Taliban executing its program, which is not to wait till the foreigners are gone and then compromise, but rather to topple the government and take power themselves.
If I go back to Ambassador Cunningham, I mean, how much of a blame does the Afghan government deserve for peace talks moving so slowly?
Well, there will always be a need to keep leaning into the Afghan government and indeed the Afghan political class as this process goes forward. Hopefully it will go forward. But at this stage, I think it would be hard to make the argument that the failure of the negotiations to move forward is because of the Afghan government. One has to remember that they weren't party to the Doha Agreement. The commitments that were made on their behalf were not made by them. They were made by the Americans. So I think it stands to reason that there was a certain amount of confusion, not to say reluctance, to throw themselves wholeheartedly into this enterprise, but they did. I think in Afghan terms, they did a pretty good job of not only going through the prisoner release process, but setting up a negotiating structure and a negotiating team. And I know a number of people who are on the negotiating team. Just spoke to a couple of them yesterday, who are experienced and serious people, who have, according to their own accounts, they have learned something already sitting at the table with women on the Afghan government side, talking to each other about what the future of Afghanistan might be. They don't agree hardly on anything, but it's a beginning. And for not many years, but for a number of years, we have all structured we have all struggled to open the door to an intra-Afghan negotiation. So that door is open now. We need to find a way to take advantage of it and realize that this is going to be a very difficult process. There's no getting around that. And the idea that it's going to be something that can be accomplished even in a framework concept within a space of weeks or months is just realistic, as it was when the agreement itself was signed.
Lisa, you touched on this about the sort of targeted killings of Afghan professionals, in many cases women. I mean, what is actually going on? Because something has clearly changed in the last year. We weren't seeing this sort of thing before.
Well, I want to point out that the killings of the women in Jalalabad in just the last day or two that you mentioned, the Islamic State claimed responsibility for those killings, and they have claimed responsibility for some of the other targeted killings that have happened. However, the widespread Afghan belief, and I think in some cases it's correct, is that the Taliban are behind at least some of these targeted killings. And so that it really is part of a campaign by the Taliban to intimidate the Afghan people and to make it seem that Taliban return to power is inevitable, so that they're basically coercing the Afghans into accepting that they are returning to power. So I do think it's part of a Taliban intimidation campaign, but I also acknowledge that the Islamic State is behind some of these targeted killings, and that is a real problem as well. That's a separate problem from the Taliban intimidation campaign.
Indeed, and you're right. Yes, I should have pointed out that the Islamic State did claim responsibility for that. General Dunford, you were the commander in Afghanistan. I mean, if there is a sort of an organized effort to kill Afghan professionals, should the US be putting in place its own campaign to thwart it?
Yalda, at this point, we should be in a position to support the Afghan efforts to thwart it. I mean, that's where we are in a campaign. We've been that way since 2013. And I would say this, that the support that the U.S. forces have provided over the past year has increased commensurate with the violence. And that's, of course, within the limits of the forces that are on the ground. So I think the United States can and should continue to support the Afghan forces, but certainly they have the lead on security and have now for some years.
So, I mean, you wouldn't recommend that perhaps the US should devote military and intelligence resources to sort of look at these targeted killings, if it is a strategy that's being used at the moment?
Yeah, it'd be my understanding now that the United States is actually providing intelligence support, logistics support, combat support to the Afghan forces. So I think what you're suggesting is something that is actually already being done.
Okay. And General Dunford, if I can also ask you about the critics who say, look, Afghanistan is just a distraction from worrying about sort of the bigger issues like China, for example. What would you say to that?
Yeah, so it's difficult for me, to support that kind of thesis because we're a global power with global responsibilities. And the way I look at it is we have long-term political interests, economic interests, and security interests in Afghanistan and South Asia. So the issue really is not whether we do great power competition, if that's what someone is suggesting, or whether we do Afghanistan. It's whether or not we can sustain our commitment in Afghanistan at an appropriate level in the context of our other national security requirements. And my argument would be that the current level of commitment to Afghanistan, with some adjustments, is sustainable even in the context of our broader strategic imperatives.
I'm just going to take a question from the audience. And Hamid says, is a civil war possible even with the presence of US forces? If it is, then what are the US options in such a scenario? I'm not sure who would, perhaps Lisa or General Dunford, if you wanted to address that.
Well, I would just say that let's remember that we have 2,500 U.S. forces there, but we have some 8,000 to 9,000 NATO troops there as well. So I don't think a full-fledged civil war is possible when you have that number of foreign troops still on the ground. So I think that that is important to remember, is that it's not just the U.S. There are NATO forces there doing training, assisting, backstopping the Afghan security forces.
Okay, and we have Natalie, who's saying, can any of you speak to China's increasing engagement in Afghanistan, the region more broadly, and what implications that might have on American decision-making? Perhaps either General Dunford or Richard or Ambassador Cunningham, if you...
Actually, if I could just come in to build on something that General Dunford said, because Yalda, you asked the question that one hears all the time, at least in Washington, which is, hey, isn't great power competition the real priority in national security, and of that China? And so we need to stop this madness of getting bogged down in these endless wars across the greater Middle East so as to redeploy our time, effort, resources, attention, troops to the Indo-Pacific. And of course, at some level, there's some truth to this, right? Especially when we have, when we had 160,000 troops in Iraq or in Afghanistan. But I come back to the politics of this. So we saw in Iraq what happened when ISIS built a terrorist sanctuary after our withdrawal and started inspiring attacks in the United States and planning attacks in Europe. Suddenly, the F-35s, all of that stuff was back in the Middle East, not in the Indo-Pacific, because we had to deal with that problem. God forbid we withdraw from Afghanistan and there's a mass casualty attack in the United States. It's traced back to some area where Al-Qaeda is active. But you talk about a distraction from a China policy. That's how you get a distraction from a China policy, is when you have to go back in to deal with acute security threats like that, rather than maintain a residual presence over time. So I think the way this ends up netting out, in addition to General Dunford's good point that, we're not a regional power, we're not an Asian power, we have interests around the world, is if you want to focus on China and great power competition, that you can't ignore the other security challenges, Afghanistan being the most acute of these right now. You have to have a way to balance these things and manage the security threats from a place like Afghanistan in a sustainable way. Otherwise, you ignore it for a while and it's going to consume your China policy if it gets out of hand.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, and if anyone wanted to address the question from the audience, which was to talk about China's increasing engagement in Afghanistan and the region more broadly.
Well, if I might say a word about that, following on to what Richard just said, there is actually a certain amount of convergence of interest between the United States and China in Afghanistan and the region. There's some competitive elements as well, but this is one of those areas where there is room for cooperation with China. Several years ago, going back to when I was in Afghanistan, we had rather high hopes that we could work with the Chinese to find significant projects that we could work on together to promote success in Afghanistan, support the Afghan government. We developed, for instance, a joint program for training diplomats and things like that. The promise that we thought might be there didn't prove out in the end for a variety of reasons, and the Chinese don't want to have a high-profile diplomatic role necessarily, at least one that requires them to take on much responsibility. But their interest in stability in the region is there. And that's one of the, going back to what General Dunford said earlier about the importance of a regional framework for Afghanistan. That really is a very important, even probably fundamental long-term project, is to find a way to bring the interests of all the countries in the region, which do have significant overlap, together in a constructive way, and to get them out of the hedging posture that they've been in large part because of uncertainty about what the United States is going to do and is capable of doing. So that's a key part of this diplomatic strategy that I was discussing earlier.
Can I just add
sorry,
something here?
Yeah.
I think, we see similar positions from China, Russia, even Iran, where they don't necessarily want to see a Taliban-run Afghanistan. They want stability there, but they also haven't done very much to support U.S. efforts to bring stability and to have a successful peace process. And I think this is because they have broader disagreements with the U.S. And so the temptation is just too great to sort of allow the U.S. to, keep floundering. And that's why we have not gotten a lot of support from the other regional neighbors, even though, as Ambassador Cunningham has rightly pointed out, they actually have the same fundamental goals as the U.S. does for Afghanistan.
President Trump and the Trump administration, you're part of those negotiations and discussions, Lisa, did put or try to put a lot of pressure on Pakistan. Do you think that was the right approach?
I do. As you know, President Trump suspended security assistance to Pakistan until Pakistan took action against militants and terrorists who were attacking U.S. forces in Afghanistan. And I think what we saw is there was a lot of people who thought, if the U.S. withdrew security assistance from Pakistan, the U.S.-Pakistan relationship would collapse. They would cut off security lines of communication going through Pakistan. Well, that didn't happen. And what we saw is Pakistan wanted to still have positive relations with the U.S., despite that we weren't providing this large-scale security assistance anymore. And we also saw that Pakistan played a somewhat helpful role with the Afghan peace process. They, of course, haven't done enough. They haven't used the full force of their leverage to crack down on the Taliban. The Taliban still has a safe haven in Pakistan. It still crosses into Afghanistan, sometimes with the help of Pakistan's military. So they haven't done enough. But what they did do is, on Ambassador Khalilzad's request, they released Mullah Baradar, who became the key interlocutor with Ambassador Khalilzad. That was important. They also, at times when the talks almost collapsed between the U.S. and Taliban, Pakistan did play a role. They did come in. They did help to keep the talks on track. So I think that Ambassador Khalilzad has used deft diplomacy with Pakistan, and we have gotten some support, but clearly they haven't done enough. And I think it's important for the Biden administration to make clear that their bilateral relations with Pakistan will depend on how much Pakistan helps in moving this peace process forward in Afghanistan.
Yes, because the conversation used to often be about Afghanistan, Pakistan, and that seems to be currently overlooked. The focus is more about troop withdrawal from Afghanistan rather than looking at the sort of regional issues that Afghanistan faces.
Well, I think we're always looking at the Afghanistan-Pakistan relationship. I mean, it's a complicated peace process. You've got the U.S.-Taliban element, you've got the intra-Afghan negotiations element, you've got the Pakistan-Afghanistan element, and you have the international regional element. These are a lot of different pieces. And the Afghanistan-Pakistan piece is very important. We have seen progress. President Ghani has shown trying to improve Afghanistan-Pakistan relations. So I would actually say that piece, although it moves in fits and starts, nobody's forgotten about the importance of that piece of the peace process.
I'll bring in another question from the audience. Jason Dempsey says, the discussion of metrics and conditions is premised on the idea that our efforts are building towards meeting those conditions. Yet we're building a military that will require indefinite monetary and contractor support. How do we square that circle?
Yeah, Yalda, I can take a crack at that. And Jason asked a good question. I mean, fundamentally, is our approach with the Afghan National Defense Security Forces sustainable? And it's certainly more sustainable today than it was a couple of years ago. But I think an important point is sustainable in what context, which is the whole reason why we're talking about a peace negotiation, an Afghan peace agreement, which would reduce the level of violence. So is our approach with the Afghan forces sustainable today? It's challenged. No one can argue that $5 billion a year to the Afghan National Defense Security Forces is not a significant amount of money. And no one can argue about some of the mistakes that might have been made along the way in terms of growing Afghan forces. I would say over the last couple of years, greater emphasis has been placed on reinforcing those elements of the Afghan forces that work and moving them to a more sustainable level, particularly their counterterrorism capabilities and their special operations capabilities. But the key issue is that by supporting the Afghan peace process, the environment within which the Afghan forces are operating becomes quite different, and the ability to sustain forces then becomes quite different.
Thank you, General. If I can come to you, I mean, how do you think the Biden administration is going to resolve this debate? How do you see this actually playing out internally?
Who is that for?
I said Richard, but I'm happy for anyone to jump in.
Sorry, there was a scratch on the record when you were addressing that question. Well, I think I don't know where they're going to go, and I don't know that yet they know where they're going to go. I think it feels unlikely that we will see the full withdrawal of American forces by the end of April, as required by the agreement with the Taliban. If that assumption is true, then it would. If my assumption here is true, then of course that means that something's got to take its place. What exactly takes its place? I think they're trying to resolve right now. I think there's multiple questions that they're going to have to answer in addition to the diplomacy here and what kind of end game are they aiming for and the inter-Afghan dialogue. But the other question is 2,500 troops enough, particularly if those troops start to come under basically return to the fight with the Taliban because the Taliban walks away from the peace process. And that's not an easy thing to deal with, particularly, I talked a little bit about the politics of quote, ending the forever wars and withdrawing troops. But in a president's mind, there's always going to be a difference between keeping troop levels more or less the way they are and looking like you're significantly increasing them, even if you go back to a level that we had not that many months ago. And how they sort through that, I think, is this next phase. But, General Dunford or someone else may want to address the sustainability of the current force levels, given the way conditions may well change in the next couple of months.
Yalda, I can jump on that and just highlight what we said in our report. So in the fall, when we engaged experts in and out of government, the judgment was that about 4,500 U.S. forces, in addition to the NATO forces, was about the right level at the conditions that existed in the fall. And arguably, the level of violence is certainly at or higher than it was in the fall. So there's obviously increased risk between 4,500 and 2,500. And as Richard says, that's risk that's going to have to be articulated by Secretary of Defense and the CENTCOM commander and the commander on the ground. And then the president can decide whether or not that risk is of concern to him. I mean, it isn't, these are never ones and zeros kind of issues. It's not, is 4,500 or 2,500 the number. The issue is, what is your tolerance for risk? And so, the judgment in the fall was that at or about 4,500, you could manage risk and you had sufficient forces to support the Afghan forces and again, to continue to set the conditions for a peace process. When we went from 4,500 to 2,500, now the president, I'm sure in the deliberations that are ongoing, is going to have to address the commander's input as to what the right number of forces are.
Ambassador Cunningham, can I ask you, there are some discussions that perhaps one should favor the idea of a Bonn-type conference over Doha. What are your views on that?
Well, I know that they're discussing this now in various permutations. I think one shouldn't be wedded to one particular approach to where you want to go and where you want to arrive at. The danger of moving outside the current negotiations is that one might risk moving outside the central concept of the negotiations, which, as I said before, is talks among Afghans about the future of Afghanistan. I wouldn't rule out some other forum, and there are lots of ideas floating around now. The Russians are saying they might host an alternate forum and other things. There might be another international multinational conference. There's a rumor that we might be asking the UN to take on a larger role. I think there's lots of concern about that on the Afghan and international community side. There's not a lot of clarity about what all this might mean, but to the extent, so what would be a mistake, I think, is to walk away from the central premise of the Doha Agreement, which, as I said earlier, is arriving at a peace agreement that will allow the withdrawal of international forces, and that it will result in an early ceasefire, so conditions can start to be created for a peace agreement. There are lots of ways one might create a forum or a foundation for pursuing that goal, but if this effort becomes fragmented, fragmented and incoherent, and becomes a process in which the role of the Afghans themselves is kind of marginalized, as it was at Doha, as it was at the US Taliban process at Doha. I think that would be a mistake, because it would make the possibilities for actually getting to a peace agreement much less.
I suppose if you look at the last year, one thing that hasn't happened is that no American troops have been killed. And I suppose if you're the president of the United States, isn't that sort of the right metric?
That's an important metric, but this is part of Afghan history and symbolism. For the Taliban, this is an agreement about the withdrawal of American forces. And part of that agreement about withdrawal is that we won't attack your forces while they're withdrawing. That's why they are threatening now that if the withdrawal isn't completed as proposed in the agreement, that the attacks on foreign forces will resume. That's so for an American president, yes, that's important. But the more important thing is, what are your interests and what needs to be done to preserve the interests of the United States and of its partners? And again, we have to keep coming back to the fact American forces in Afghanistan are now roughly a quarter of the international forces there. We have been working with one of the biggest coalitions in the world for years now to try to bring stability to Afghanistan. This is not just an American investment, it's an international investment. And it's not just a military or a security investment. We have many, many partners who've invested political capital and financial resources in trying to stabilize Afghanistan and eventually get to a peace agreement. So it's a multilateral proposition, and the only consideration can't simply be, are we running the risk of having our forces attacked?
Sure, absolutely. And I'm just going to go to a question from the audience. Jared says, how important are overseas safe havens to jihadist groups targeting the West today as it compared to a decade or two ago? I'm not sure if Lisa or General Dunford or someone wants to.
Yalda, I can start and then ask someone to jump in. I mean, obviously less important today from the perspective, as I mentioned in my opening remarks. Our judgment is that the pressure that groups in the region are under to conduct operations against the United States and its allies, that pressure has disrupted attacks externally. But long term, I would judge that region to be incredibly important from a geographic and even historical perspective. And You see a lot of the literature from extremist groups, particularly Al-Qaeda, the importance of the Khorasan. You see that also with regard to ISIS. And so I think from a historic and a psychological perspective, the region remains very important. And obviously from a geographic perspective, the reasons that they chose to operate from South Asia in the first place in 2001 haven't changed. And that's because it's conducive to these kinds of safe havens from which operations can be planned and conducted.
Thank you, General. I don't know if Lisa, did you want to?
Yeah, I agree with everything General Dunford just said. And just to acknowledge the UN report that was raised earlier says about 300 to 500 Al-Qaeda operatives in Afghanistan. But I would mention these are some of the most senior leaders of Al-Qaeda. And as an example, over the last 18 months, Afghan forces working with their U.S. counterparts have been able to remove 4 very senior Al-Qaeda leaders from Afghanistan. So that shows that there are still key leaders in that area that still present a threat. And as I mentioned before, I think we also have to think about what kind of a boost that gives to foreign terrorist fighters, terrorists everywhere. If the Taliban portrays this as we've been able to kick the U.S. and 40 NATO countries out of Afghanistan. We've won. I think we face that specter of reemergent terrorist safe haven. But just to mention that we still see major Al-Qaeda leaders there. Yes, their numbers are reduced, but they're still there.
And so, Lisa, isn't that just a clear breach of this deal?
Yes, I think as I argued in my remarks, we've seen no indication that the Taliban has broken from Al-Qaeda. What we see is they may be telling them to lie low just until international forces depart. But then what? I think nobody's really answered that question. And for all of the talk of enforcement mechanisms in the agreement, I've not seen any enforcement mechanisms carried out in terms of trying to ensure that the Taliban really are breaking ties with Al-Qaeda, that they're not going to allow Al-Qaeda to regenerate once forces leave.
Richard, did you want to jump?
I think it's just worth pointing out the agreement doesn't require the Taliban to break with Al-Qaeda. So it requires the Taliban to not allow Al-Qaeda to use Afghan soil to launch attacks against the United States or its allies, to not provide travel documents to Al-Qaeda members who want to come to Afghanistan. But that's a far cry from breaking with Al-Qaeda or pushing Al-Qaeda out. And the Taliban has had 20 years of unrelenting pressure on it, militarily, economically, diplomatically, everything. The foremost objective of that has been to get them to essentially break with Al-Qaeda, and they've declined to do so, which I think says a lot about the enduring nature of the linkage between those two groups.
Yeah, and as General Dunford pointed out, I mean, U.S. Treasury itself said that Al-Qaeda influence has increased under the protection of the Taliban.
Yeah, exactly. So, that in a way, the peace agreement went after, I guess, a thing that one could go after, which is these sort of the use of Al-Qaeda. It appears just beyond the Taliban's reach to decide that they want to actually break with Al-Qaeda, which in turn poses a number of follow-on problems. If you envision sort of what are the conditions under which the United States might continue to protect its counterterrorism interests in a post-withdrawal environment. And people have said, well, you cut a deal with the Taliban and share intelligence so that they, can sort of tell you where Al-Qaeda is and we can go bomb them or things like that. But trying to square that with this uninterruptible relationship between these two groups of people seems quite difficult.
The White House has released its interim national security strategy guidance, and it says it won't fight forever wars, and it will bring the Afghan conflict to a conclusion, while also preventing Afghanistan from ever becoming a sanctuary for international terrorism. So what exactly does that mean?
Yalda, I won't, speak for the administration and what it means, but I do want to take on this issue of a forever war. As you've already highlighted, we haven't lost an American in a year. We have 2,500 forces on the ground inside of Afghanistan right now. And the idea of a forever war, I think that terminology doesn't do justice to what is going on in Afghanistan today. The question in Afghanistan, and as I suggested, in the region as a whole is, do we have the right diplomatic, economic, and security approach to our national interests in the region, which are enduring? And I would argue, again, that the real issue should be, is our approach sustainable in the context of our other challenges, and not just focused on this rhetoric of a forever war, which is actually emotional and doesn't, in my view, adequately describe the situation in Afghanistan. So I think that you can actually do what you just related that the administration wants to do. You can begin to bring peace to Afghanistan. You can get our approach in Afghanistan and the region to a sustainable level, and you can do that both from a force level as well as a fiscal resource perspective.
Thank you, General. We've just got a few minutes to go. I've just got another question I want to quickly put to Lisa from the audience. What role will or can Congress play in the future U.S. strategy in Afghanistan?
Well, I think Congress has been playing a very important role. They have initiated legislation to be able to have a say in how quickly this drawdown goes, and tying it directly to progress in the peace talks, so that we're not operating just on a timeline. And I think Congress has been very deliberate about that, that we meet certain conditions before withdrawing our troops. So I think we'll see that role continue from both sides of the aisle. I think that's what's really striking, is we do see, you can't really say one side of the aisle is completely supportive of withdrawing and the other side wants to stay. It's mixed up. You see senior congressional leaders who have been involved on the armed services committees or the foreign relations committees, who follow international conflicts very closely and foreign relations. They seem to come together on the need for the U.S. to follow a conditions-based strategy, not a time-based strategy for U.S. troop withdrawal. So I would just try to make a distinction between the politics of the issue and certain congressional leaders who may push a certain line because of the politics, and those congressional leaders who are focusing on U.S. national security interests and looking ahead and what is in the strategic interest of the United States.
Lisa, thank you. And we only have really a minute left. I don't know if anyone else has any sort of final thoughts about how they see this sort of future strategy of Afghanistan and the United States.
Could I just say that, building on what Lisa just said, I think the most important thing going forward is to get out of the trap of artificial deadlines. This can't be done in a hurry, and it can't be done against a deadline, because deadline just encourage everybody to wait and see what happens when you reach the deadline rather than working for success. So if we're going to work for success, we have to get back to a concern about the conditions and how to create them and achieve them in order to get the goal that we want.
Yalda, maybe I just add one last thought here, and it gets to the role of Congress, but also to the role of our political leaders across the board, which is Afghanistan is not a topic of discussion very much, even really in policy circles, certainly the way it used to be, and for obvious reasons. But if the president does decide to maintain a military presence in Afghanistan, which I think everyone on this panel thinks is better than the alternative of leaving completely, it's incumbent on our political leaders, I think, to explain much better what the idea is here, because it's incomprehensible to a lot of people to think that after 20 years of fighting and billions of dollars and casualties and all this other stuff, that we're still saying, well, it's too soon to leave. Just give us more time. We'll work something out. Maybe the Afghans will talk to each other. I think it just, I described at the beginning that the politics of this, I think, is thin in terms of the intensity with which people would like to see, quote, an end to the forever wars. But it's widespread because there is a sense of what the hell is going on over there where, we've got all these other priorities and yet we're still there seeming to make no progress. And that, has got policy implications, but got big communications aspects too. And I think having a little bit of leadership behind whatever policy is chosen by the administration, both the administration and Congress, would go a long way with connecting with the American people who ultimately need to support this.
Absolutely. And I don't know if General Dunford or Lisa have some final thoughts.
No, thanks, Yalda. I mean, I guess my point would be that if people believe, as I do, that we have an opportunity for peace that we haven't had in the past 20 years, and we can argue about the probability, but we have an opportunity. The issue is, do we right now do everything we can do to try to take advantage of that opportunity? And by the way, if we do seek to take advantage of that opportunity, it doesn't work out, all of the other pathways that we're speaking about today would be available after that. So, were we to decide to depart completely sometime in the future, we can still do that if this peace process doesn't work out. But it certainly seems to me from the 10 months that we spent in the Afghan study group that the consensus inside of Afghanistan, inside of the region, and with all of those who have been a part of Afghanistan for the past 2 decades, the consensus is for peace. And what we ought to do is have no regret factor with regard to our focus on doing everything we possibly can do to take advantage of this opportunity. If the opportunity turns out, again, not to work out, we can deal with that later. But not taking advantage of this opportunity after 2 decades, to me, makes no sense.
I'll just build on that. Yes, we've had troops in Afghanistan for 20 years at several different troop levels, but we've only started a real peace process the last 2.5 years with the appointment of Ambassador Khalilzad in September 2018. So again, I think that should be in people's minds that, have we done everything possible to make a peace process work, given all of the investment that has gone into Afghanistan, given what we know can happen when we turn our back on the country. Have we done everything possible to make it work?
Thank you. Well, thank you for this thoughtful conversation. And I know the many Afghans I speak to are waiting and watching to see what, lies for them and their future. And I really do appreciate you sharing all of your analysis and thoughts here today. General Dunford, Richard, Ambassador Cunningham, Lisa, thank you very much for joining us. And thank you to the audience for all of your questions and for being part of this session this afternoon. Thank you.